Well, thank you, Joe, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this lovely place, institution, and the lovely city of Bath. I've got fond memories, mostly, of Bath. In fact, it's where we were engaged, Kate, my wife there, and where we were engaged and where we had our first massive row straight after. But we've been together for 35 years ever since, so all's well that ends well. So tonight, I'm going to be talking about the British and Afghanistan, and in particular Welsh involvement over almost 2 centuries. I'll be talking about the three Anglo-Afghan wars. I'll be focusing on the first one of them, and then going on to Operation Enduring Freedom, which of course started with the attack on the World Trade Center. Within that, I'll be looking in particular at Operation Herrick, which was the British contribution. And out of that, 2009 is the year we'll be looking at tonight. That's when I was with the Queen's Dragoon Guards and we got ambushed on March the 1st. And then we'll have some questions. So, an ancient mountainous country overrun by a foreign oppressor and ever since beset by internecine tribal warfare. I am, of course, talking about Wales. The Welsh have had a long history of supplying young men and women into the British forces, more of which later. Now, Afghanistan. Caught there in the middle of Central Europe, squeezed. It's a crossroads, but squeezed between rival competing empires for most of its history. But it's led also to it being a mosaic of ethnicities. The one that we're going to be concentrating on tonight are the Pashtuns. Here in orange, this great arc around the southern wide arc across the south of the country and into Pakistan. Hundreds of Pashtun tribes, Duranis, Afridis, the Ghilzai, numbering probably about 30 million. We don't know for sure because there haven't been many censuses done. And their language is Pashto, which is an Indo-Iranian language. Now, the Pashtuns, or Pathans, as they also been known in history, are one of those tribes that the British Empire loved to demonize, calling them bloodthirsty, frightening, ruthless. In fact, in 1897, a young Winston Churchill, writing for the Daily Telegraph when he was in the northwest frontier provinces, characterized them thus: death by inches and hideous mutilation are the inevitable measure of all who fall in battle into the hands of the Pathan tribesmen. Forgetting, of course, that these were people whose country had been invaded twice that century already by the British Empire in unprovoked and rather punitive attacks. Afghanistan was a victim of the so-called Great Game played between the British Empire and Tsarist Russia. The whole area of Central Asia was peppered with shadowy figures, political envoys, diplomats, officers, who were all spying on, these were Russians and British, all spying on each other and all trying to influence the leadership in the regional capitals like Kabul. The British were deeply concerned that the Russians had designs on Afghanistan as a base for invading India. Then, of course, the British India, the jewel in the British Empire, the jewel in the crown. This was probably paranoid, definitely self-fulfilling, and led to some very poor and disastrous decision-making. and it's thought that the threat was also exaggerated and got up by the British East India Company, based in Calcutta, for its own commercial interests. So in 1839, the British thought that Dost Muhammad Khan, the present ruler in Kabul, was leaning towards Russia, and they finally snapped and decided to invade and to put in place their own man, Shah Shuja, who himself was a previous ruler of Afghanistan. So an enormous army was gathered, the army of the Indus, and in 1839 passed through the Bolan Pass, southern Afghanistan. This really was a massive army. 1,000 men and officers from Britain, 14,000 East India Company sepoys or infantry, 6,000 irregular soldiers hired by Shah Shuja, 38,000 Indian camp followers, and 30,000 camels, carrying even more luggage than my wife does on holiday. So the British, though, this army made swift progress through the passes, brushing off the Pathan tribesmen in the hills, ambushing them, and quickly got to Kabul and installed their man. Now, this initial success, I think, this initial success bred a certain overconfidence, and what happened was they sent back a large part of the invading force. That, together with some very bad behavior on the part of the occupying force towards the locals, quickly turned everyone against Shah Shuja, who they just saw as the puppet of an unwelcome foreign power. With the result that after some assassinations of British officials, a full-scale rebellion kicks off, and the British occupying force, the garrison there, is really underpowered now, so simply can't cope with what happens. With the result that the British are forced into a retreat from Kabul in the teeth of an Afghan winter, January 1842. They retreat through those same passes that they came by, and they're picked off then by those Pathan tribesmen in the hills with their long-barreled Jezail rifles. And by the time we get to Gandamak, the so-called last stand, 4,500 British and Indian soldiers have died, and 12,000 civilians, a few hundred, then taken prisoner back to Kabul. A very famous painting that, as is this one. Dr. Bryden was one of the very few Europeans to make it out of those passes to the safety of the British garrison at Jalalabad. He was an army surgeon. A warning from history, perhaps, too often ignored by putative invaders ever since, you might think. Now, throughout this sorry saga, one man stands out, and he was a Welshman, Sir William Knott, who I think might be the first Welshman, the one I've identified in the historical record as the first Welsh soldier into Afghanistan. He was part of that army of the Indus in 1839, but he was kept back from Kabul and told to hold Kandahar with his 3,000 men, which he did successfully throughout the subsequent uprising. He was the son of a farmer from Neath and went to Cowbridge Grammar School. He didn't think much of the education he got there. Looking back, he said, "I never received any schooling but what my own fist knocked into my dull head after I left my fatherland." Sort of a school of life man. So by 1842, the summer, the British had had quite enough of Afghanistan and were determined to leave, but not without delivering a dose of revenge for their humiliating defeat. So they raised the ominously named Army of Retribution. In charge was General Pollock, and he was told that he had to, he couldn't leave without teaching the Afghans a lesson for what had happened. And General Nott was invited along too. He jumped at the chance, because he hadn't been doing very much in Kandahar, and he'd been champing at the bit all through to get on the front foot, as he would have said. So, this is also when we can identify the first Welsh unit into Afghanistan, the 41st of Foot, which became the Welsh Regiment, and then, of course, after army reorganisation, the Royal Welsh. So they and other units dispatched from Britain bulked out Nott's Kandahar force to 6,000 people, 6,000 men, and they were now in a race to Kabul because Nott wanted to get there to steal General Pollock's thunder. The first in the way was the citadel of Ghazni. They had to retake it, which they did because they defeated a large force of Durrani tribesmen in the hills, and the next day just marched in. Unfortunately, this is where military discipline breaks down. General Nott's men plundered, murdered, raped and pillaged the citadel, and that went on all the way to Kabul, burning down villages and their orchards so that they couldn't eat. And also, sadly for General Nott, he didn't get there first. Pollock's men had got there and had already started to fall on the city and its surrounds, again burning down villages, murdering, the usual, and other pointless acts of revenge, like burning down the ancient and beautiful central bazaar in the middle of town. However, all of this revenge was judged a great success, and everybody got back to India in time for tea and medals. General Nott himself was made resident of Lucknow, honoured with, made Knight of the Order of the Bath, given a tidy pension from the East India Company. He retired to Carmarthen, where he died in 1845, and you can still see a statue of him there today. So the men of the Army of Retribution also got their battle honours, and if you go to the Royal Welsh Regimental Museum in Brecon, you can see the Kandahar, Ghazni and Kabul medals awarded to 4 privates there. So much for the first Afghan war. I'm going to skip over the second and third ones because there isn't much of a Welsh connection with either of those two. And actually for the rest of the 20th century, there isn't a strong Welsh connection with Afghanistan either, unless you include the antics of the Qazi of Calabar, Sir Sidney Rough Diamond, and the 3rd Regiment of Foot and Mouth. The makers of Carry On Up the Khyber couldn't film in the lawless northwest frontier provinces, so thought Snowdonia would make a good stand-in. If the costumes, the uniforms look strangely familiar, that's because they were borrowed from earlier war films. The webbing and the helmets were borrowed from the makers of, can anyone guess? Zulu. Yeah, 1963, 5 years before. So the 2 other Welshmen we can identify as being involved in Afghanistan in the 20th century. This is David Nott, You may recognize him. He's become a famous war surgeon. Another not from Carmarthen. Now, I don't know if he's related. I have emailed him and he's not replied. But he was there in his first tour of duty there was in 1996 when the Taliban were there. And actually that's when I was there too, 1996, and in 1992 when the Mujahideen were, if you remember, fighting each other and destroying large parts of Kabul. I was a video journalist, a video producer, working with BBC correspondents, including Lise Doucette, that's not her, but including the region's correspondents there. So we now arrive at the 21st century. Operation Enduring Freedom kicked off as America's response to the attack on the World Trade Center in 2001, part of the so-called War on Terror. It started with an American invasion of Afghanistan to rid the country of the Taliban government, who were hosting, of course, Al-Qaeda in the Tora Bora Mountains. Now, the British contribution to this effort was called Herrick, Operation Herrick. As you can see, Welsh units were very busy throughout this period. The Royal Welsh, the infantry, were there 4 times. The Welsh Guards were there twice, including Herrick 10, 2009. That was a torrid tour for them. They lost men at all ranks, including their commanding officer. The worst casualty list that any regiment had suffered, certainly since the Falklands War and for probably decades before that. Queen's Dragoon Guards, the Welsh Cavalry, did 3 tours, and I was there on Herrick 9 2009, and I was there as well 2014, which was the last tour of any British regiment. They closed down Camp Bastion and flew out with the flag. I arrived in 2009 as an embedded journalist with the BBC. This was going to turn out to be the worst year for casualties for the British. 105 died that year alone. What was doing most of the damage were these improvised explosive devices, which could destroy vehicles, kill and maim the personnel inside. The response to this growing threat, here's an example of a very, very simple IED, just a plastic bottle with a fragmentation bomb and a rope pull cord. But they could also be extremely sophisticated, triggered by pressure plates or by remote control, command wires. IEDs killed 224 British soldiers in Afghanistan. That's more than any other form of munitions or warfare. The response, part of the response to this threat was to up armor. This is a Mastiff vehicle. It gave tremendous, much increased protection, but was incredibly sort of awkward and clumsy, hard to get around corners in small Afghan villages. And this is inside a Mastiff. This is Trooper Steve Panks, who's driving me around on patrol. Now, Steve was in his Mastiff a few months before I arrived, with his commander, Corporal Phil Meadows. I'm now going to show you what happened to these two when they were in that Mastiff. I've got some film here, which is filmed from a US Navy Hornet, F-18 Hornet. Let's see if we can get that to play. Okay, so where are we? Here we go. Two mastiffs on Roof near Garcia. They are delivering troops to some patrol bases. Steve and Phil are in the first mastiff there. They'd been joking at this time about getting blown up because they'd heard about an explosion that had happened not far away. And then this happens. So that is, afterwards they discovered that that was an IED consisting of 50 kilograms of high explosive with probably an anti-tank mine added for good measure. So, how did we get onto the next? There we go. Now, luckily nobody died in that, probably because of the armor of the Mastiff, but it did cause some life-changing injuries for Corporal Phil Meadows. I went up to North Wales, where he now lives, to see how he was doing, and here he's describing to me the immediate aftermath of that explosion.
I stood up. I asked if Steve was all right. He said, yeah, he was all right. At that point, I must have been full of adrenaline because I thought I was all right as well. Started trying to get everyone on the radio, but the radio wasn't working. And then I sat down, and then all the alarms were going off. My knee dislocated.
When you looked down at your leg, what did you see?
If this was a normal knee, after I sat down, my knee had pretty much separated like this. Internally it had come off, but the skin had kept it on. There was a large laceration on the back.
Not everyone does take to the prosthetic, do they, because of the nature of what's left of their leg?
Yeah, I've got a full femur, so fortunately that I've got a long stump, and there is scars on it. There is pain and stuff like that, but you do learn to. Your threshold does develop or increase, so you could manage it.
What sort of pain?
I get phantom pain, and obviously pain from blisters and walking. As you're getting older, more weight's going on your residual limb or your remaining limbs, so your knees start to hurt, your hips.
So I wanted to show you that because, we rightly commemorate the deaths of our soldiers, but sometimes we forget about those who got serious injuries and have to live with them for the rest of their lives, and sometimes things get worse for them as well, although, they bear them, as Phil does, with extraordinary, determination. So, let me just go back. So another vehicle, we've talked about the Mastiff there, another vehicle was rushed into service just before I arrived because of this IED threat. It was to replace this vehicle, the armoured Land Rover, also known as a Snatch, also known as a death trap. 37 UK soldiers died in these in Iraq and Afghanistan before the MOD decided to do anything about it. In 2006, in fact, 2 QDGs died in one of these in Basra. That was Lance Corporal Farrelly and Lieutenant Tom Mildenhall, with whom I'd been filming actually only a few months before. Its replacement was the Jackal, much better protected underneath. It had a kind of a U-shaped hull which could deflect IEDs better, and much better armed above. That's a heavy machine gun on the top and a general purpose machine gun on the front. You can trace the ancestry of that vehicle right the way back to the deserts of North Africa and the Second World War, operated by the Long Range Desert Group and the SAS Brigade. You might have seen some of these in action in the BBC TV series. These were fast vehicles that could run around and cause havoc behind Rommel's lines. So I was going to be on one of these. They might have been fast and furious, but they weren't 100% bomb-proof. In fact, 2 weeks after I left theatre, a QDG Jackal was blown up, and 2 corporals, Dean John and Graham Stiff, died. But this was going to be the vehicle I was going to be using. The open-topped nature of them made them great platforms for the gunners, wide arc of fire, unimpeded, and very good for the cameraman as well. Unimpeded vision, and then I could duck down underneath when things got hairy, as we'll see later. Now, what's happened there? Oh, here we go, sorry. So yeah, this is where we come to the ambush. I've got an 11-minute film here which shows what happened that day, March the 1st. Oh no, hold on, I think we might have missed a few. I think we have missed a few slides there. Let me just have a look. What's going on? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to do these and then go back. They've ended up in the wrong order for some reason. So we've just talked about this IED threat, and the response now is to interdict Taliban movements and disrupt those IED bomb-making facilities in this southern arc of southern Helmand. This is the village of Mian Poshte, 13 miles south of Garmsir, and the mission is to go in there with a large group of QDG Jackals and Afghan National Army and disrupt the Taliban movement. This is the green zone, so called because it's this wide sort of band of fertile land irrigated by canals coming off the River Helmand. I'm going to show you in a moment then the film of what unfolded on March the 1st. Just a note on some of the acronyms that the Army loves. ID is to identify, PID is positively identify, ANA is Afghan National Army, call signs are what the Army calls soldiers, and friendly call signs are soldiers on our side. So I'm going to go back and I'll play this film of what happened that day. Oh, no, I'm not. Back again. All right, let's try that then.
We're now minutes away from Operation Capture Spin 4. There are 36 infantry, 90 from the Afghan National Army, and 40 Welsh Cavalry in their Jackals and Mastiffs. As our 40 vehicles push forward, in the skies above, a B-1 bomber patrols and helicopters stand by. A few miles further on, there's a sobering sight. We go past a cemetery. I point out to Louis that the green and white flags mark the graves of martyrs, dead holy warriors.
Yeah, and there looks to be a lot of them. I think there might be a few more added to the by tomorrow, I'm sure.
The fact that they push south from here means that they don't want to decisively engage us, which means that they haven't got strength in numbers and they're a bit cowardice really in their approach.
The decision's taken to go to a disused school and secure it for the overnight stay. All seems calm. One of the guys has put a leak on his wagon to mark St. David's Day, and I'm about to interview Mance.
What was that, man? Louis.
Contact! Shit, one's landed over there to the south, east!
The burning bush and smoke in the distance is where the insurgents have fired from. A Taliban RPG rocket has missed us by just 30 metres. The men think this may be just a parting gesture from the insurgents.
I think that might have been a shooting scoot.
RPG, or was it also small arms?
RPG, I don't know who the small arms come from. It could have been Taliban or the ANA responding.
It's quiet again. Louis begins to relax. That's a mistake. Another rocket's on its way, the start of a full-on ambush.
That's fucking close. Yeah, I've got eyes on! Back up! Go that way! Go that way! It's through the gap here! I can't get eyes on! It's on the fucking bush! That bush over there, mate! You see his fucking trains going over! The RPG came straight from the west!
Forward.
They have to remain calm and work quickly to spot the enemy and move the wagons to a better place to fire back.
Wait before you fire! Mac, you stay there, Mac, come back, use the TFG.
The big challenge is hitting the enemy and not your own side. Friendly call signs, British and Afghan ANA, are out there somewhere.
Wait before you fire!
You just gotta be careful that they don't push into those compounds there.
I confirm there's no friendly call signs there.
Because they
West
can
of the
just
canal,
collect
our location.
You've got ANA call signs over there as well.
Okay, friendly call signs for the mini ferrets!
Louis knows he's closer than ever to firing his weapon in anger for the first time. He gets it ready. No soldier likes to be on the back foot, so they push forward to drive the attackers back. And the Taliban retreat from one compound to another.
That compound there in front!
Finally, they see a clear target. Mance orders everyone to open fire. The Welsh Cavalry's heavy machine guns are in full flow. This intense fire should keep the enemy's head down, but instead, they return fire with RPG rockets. So the priority now is to bring in the weapon the Taliban really hate, the grenade machine guns, GMGs. These can fire more than 300 high explosives a minute over the walls of compounds used by the insurgents. Each grenade will kill or maim within a 5-metre zone. The combined firepower of a troop of jackals is an awesome thing. Red-hot tracer fire is aimed at enemy positions just 200 metres away. But Taliban rounds are still coming back. Time then to bring in air power in the shape of 2 British Apache helicopters known as AH. They've been circling for half an hour, waiting to get a clear view of the insurgents hiding in the compounds.
They'd be fucking crazy to stick their heads up now, like.
The Apaches are lining up their targets.
AH is just waked in for any movement, they're going to drop on it, okay? The PID something. AH is engaging.
AH is engaging, Lou. AH is engaging.
Yeah, that's better.
Their heavy cannons open up, making an unmistakable deadly sound.
Someone's dying.
Enemy firing positions fall silent.
Penblwydd hapus, Dewi Sant.
We're told over the radio the Apaches have just killed around 10 Taliban and destroyed a vehicle full of explosives.
I'm quite surprised that they engaged us whilst having air assets up in the air.
Pretty brave.
There could be a new foot on the ground for them, look. So it's a gutsy move because the thermal imagery equipment on the Apaches is a lot better than what our ground sights are.
With the battle over for now, it's time to return to the school for the night. We're staying in the middle of hostile Taliban territory and the insurgents could attack again. The Afghans and the British mount a round-the-clock guard and the wagons form up into a ring of steel around the building. As darkness falls, I want to hear from Mance and Louis about the 2.5-hour firefight we've just been through.
We were having incoming tracer rounds landing about 10 to 15 metres in front of our vehicle until we put a heavy weight of fire down in the direction that they were coming from. So yeah, it was quite close call really today on the contact front.
Seemed pretty cool. And nervous. You seem nervous, and you know. You look
Yeah,
like you were
I think more of
excited
it's nervousness, and I was a lot excited as well, because it seemed to go on and off for a long period of time, which I think is it's new to me anyway, and I think it's just adjusting yourself and getting around to doing things like that.
The initial sort of haze of contact, you've got to take that sort of second to remain calm for a few seconds until the higher commander's formulated his plan. I remember the first time that I was in contact, it's quite nerve-wracking, and you look into the person who's next in charge, and you can see that they're calm, and that calms you down. Because I was the person in charge, there's quite a responsibility on my shoulders to remain calm and give direction to the guys who are beneath me. So I think that's quite an important fact. But it's quite a surreal situation. You're quite focused on what you need to do, the job that you need to do, and the training that you've had, and to carry out what you need to carry out, and afterwards perhaps you can reflect on it, but you're so focused on the job at hand that you remain calm really throughout it all.
Does every soldier want a contact? Does he feel better for it, do you think, Louis?
Yeah, I'd say a lot. I wouldn't say all of the guys would want a contact. The guys who do want them, obviously they'd want them just for a bit more experience, I would think, to try maybe and test themselves. Obviously ensuring that no one's going to get hurt. That's the last thing anybody would be wanting. Yeah, that's what I always wanted a contact out here, just to see what it was like, and just from looking on it today, it is a whole new experience altogether.
A good one?
Yeah, and a bad one in the same way.
The night passes peacefully, and there would be no more enemy offensives that day. With With dawn comes evidence of the pummeling the Taliban have taken. 3 bodies, including this one thought to be of a commander, have been brought to the building by the Afghan army for formal identification. It's thought 15 enemy fighters died in this operation on St. David's Day, but it took a huge array of soldiers and weapons to do it.
So, that was what the firefight looked like on the ground, filmed by me in the Jackal with my little camera. What I'd like to do now is show you what that battle looked like from the air. This is footage filmed by a Predator drone, which is hovering above, sitting above those 2 Apache helicopters. You might see one of the helicopters cross over below in a moment. But let's have a look at this. And this is unbroadcast material that I had at the time, but the MOD wouldn't let me broadcast it, but I can now. Here is a group of Taliban fighters gathering, lining up. Nobody can do anything about it because of the rules of engagement. They're suspect, but they're not doing anything. This is a pickup truck clearly of interest to the forward air controllers who are monitoring it. Again, they can't engage it. They don't know who's in it. But here, in a moment, we'll see what happens here. But here's a burst of fire from one of those Apaches to the left. There must be Taliban hiding behind this wall here, and this guy here as well must be armed because it's attracting the interest of the Apaches, who, as you see, will start firing again. That's one of the Apaches crossing over there to go onto the right, but this one on the left is lining up now with its 30mm cannon, and there's a burst of fire there and there. Not much left of those walls. You'll see another figure here trying to escape. There's a group of goats or something in the middle there. Okay, this guy's running for his life. They're lining up. They miss him, and he tries to make a run for it there, and there's no sign of life after that. Now, if you remember the pickup truck I mentioned earlier, that's it there. It's parked up. And you'll see what happens to this in a moment. They've clearly decided that under their rules of engagement, they can attack it. Burst of fire, and then there's an enormous explosion, justifying their suspicions that it was packed full of high explosive. They think it was a suicide vehicle that was heading our way, and luckily it didn't get across any of those canals to get to us. So somebody perhaps had a lucky escape there. So, nobody on our, there were no casualties on our side that day, and men were feeling relieved, in fact, happy about what they'd achieved that day. I think about 15 Taliban, all told, were killed, including some commanders. But after a couple of days of holding Mian Poshte and showing the Taliban this great force of show of strength, everybody was pulled out. And that caused a lot of frustration amongst the blokes, having put their lives on the line. The British forces never really had the capability to hold territory for very long. And they were pulled back to their forward operating base. So which brings us really to a sort of final reckoning of the costs of the war. 32 Welsh soldiers died over the period, 24 of them there. All told, there were 457 UK deaths, 616 serious or very serious casualties. It cost us 27.7 billion. 70,000 Afghan National Army and police died. 46,000 Afghan civilians, probably an underestimate, and 53,000 Taliban opposition fighters died. Again, probably an underestimate. We really don't know. So, as a sort of an epilogue, really, there is an ongoing Welsh connection, or was up until last year, an ongoing Welsh connection with Afghanistan in the shape of Martin Griffiths, who was brought up in Cardiff. He was, until he retired just a few months ago, he was an Under-Secretary General at the UN, the UN's most senior aid chief, and he was in Kabul in 2022, pleading with the Taliban to reverse their the ban that they put in place on women going to university and on girls going to secondary schools. He was unsuccessful in that. And I find that very poignant, because whenever I speak to some of the blokes since and ask them whether it was all worth it, one of the very few arguments they had left, in fact, was, well, at least we made it safe for Afghans, especially girls and women, and enabled them to get an education. Well, they can't even say that now. So I think that that finishes the talk, and I'm very willing to take any questions from you. Yes, Francis.
Hang on 1 second. I'm just going to bring a microphone so that the quite large number of people who are listening on Zoom can hear everyone. So please hold it close to your lips, Francis.
Can you tell us how good were the Afghan soldiers you were fighting with? Were they really committed to the cause, or were they ambivalent?
I think some of them were very brave and very serious about what they were doing. Unfortunately, they weren't the basic things that you entitled to have as a soldier were not provided for them. You know, things like decent pay, holidays, even you could probably argue a sort of a reason to exist. You know, who were they fighting for? I think the British did, and the Americans did, as much as they could to sort of inculcate a sort of a camaraderie and a corps d'esprit. But morale was often, you know, not all it could be because of those other reasons. So I think individuals and some commanders were extremely competent because they'd been fighting in the Mujahideen. Some of them had fought the Soviets. So, you know, they knew what they were doing, but we tried to increase the size of that army as we were leaving. We tried to increase that army far too quickly, recruited far too quickly. Training was really poor. Then they had, I think, 2 months or maybe 3 months basic training, and that was it. Nothing after that. So I met some good Afghan fighters, but I think generally they were up against it. And they took terrible, terrible casualties as a result.
Thank you, Gareth. There's a question from the online chat before we take some more in the room. The question from the online was a simple one. Did you ever feel in danger when you were doing this filming?
Yes. But I mean, especially when that RPG came over, because those jackals, They are good against rounds, not so well protected against RPG, rocket-propelled grenades. But I'd taken every precaution I possibly could to sort of bury myself in that vehicle. And actually, the blokes around me, I had a lot of faith in. And, they put down an awful lot of suppressive fire, which when you're just listening to it sounds horrific, but actually, they did tell me at the time, they should keep their heads down, so I didn't feel vulnerable a lot of the time.
Great. In the room, one at the back. Okay, David.
Thank you. To follow on from Francis's question, what happened to the Afghan National Army soldiers after the Americans pulled out in 2021? Were they incorporated into the Taliban? Were they slaughtered, or did they just go back to their lives beforehand?
So they fought on quite valiantly, many of them. It wasn't an immediate Taliban victory. I think for about 2 years, they tried to defend some of those district centres, Lashkar, Sangin, these places. But as I said, they took terrible, terrible casualties. The Taliban threw waves of people at them. And as a result, they were disbanded because, they had a loyalty to an entity that the Taliban didn't recognize, so they had no use for them. They would have gone back to their villages, those that survived, and carried on, and who knows what they're doing now.
Okay, it's not a question, but from the online chat, Penelope says, thank you for a riveting and illuminating talk. So thank you for that, Penelope. I've got another question in the room, another 2 questions in the room. First, Brian first.
Thank you for a very interesting talk, and I think it must have been a fascinating period of time for you. My question is really, was there any time when you had a cameraman with you, or were you taking all the film yourself?
So I was the main cameraman throughout all of that, but some of that footage was taken as well from head cams that the soldiers themselves had. So, because, if you played that back again, you'd notice that there were lots of different angles on the same scene. I couldn't possibly have got all of those angles from my standpoint. But so I would say 75% was mine, 25% was head cams of the soldiers. And I did have an assistant cameraman as well, but he stayed up on the hill. So I don't think in that sequence there are any shots of his. He was up there really looking at, actually he was with me at the beginning before. So that troop of jackals, there were 2 troops actually, and they split. So one was Mike, and he went up on the hill, and then I carried on with the other troop that went into that village of Mian Poshte. So the very beginning of that journey through the desert, some of the shots are his.
Okay, another question here. Hold it.
The soldiers you were filming with there, have you spoken to them since the end of the conflict, and kind of what's going on there, like in terms of their reflections, but how they're doing and that kind of thing? Yeah,
I have. I really do keep in touch with as many of them as possible. Including, as you saw there, Corporal Meadows, who's doing okay. He's got a job, a BT engineer. I think BT engineer he was then. But Mance, who was the sergeant major, the troop sergeant major in charge there, he is still in the regiment. But sadly, he got some sort of, I better not say these things, because some of these things are personal, but he's still in the regiment, and he's been promoted to captain. I think I'm probably going to get promoted to major, and he's one of these stalwarts of the British Army, an NCO, and then become a late commission officer, and they are the salt of the earth, these guys, and he carries on. Actually, Louis, the gunner, I haven't kept in touch with him. I don't know what happened to him. See, a lot of the guys, they sort of, they loved Afghanistan. These were their battle honours, the feather in their cap. They all wanted a contact, but they didn't want to stay in the army. That was job done for them, and they all left. A lot of the guys, anyway. So I don't know what happened to Louis. But yeah, I go back to the barracks. The QDG are in Norfolk, and I go back there as much as I can, and also Cardiff headquarters as well, to keep in touch with what people are doing. Yeah.
Okay, got another question.
Yeah, it's more an observation, really. I'm interested that you say that the ANA were able to fight on for up to 2 years after the pullout. I haven't heard that. I find that surprising as well, because their real weakness was lack of logistics, and not only military logistics, commercial contracted logistics. And with the military pullout, the contractors pulled out, and I'm mystified how they could have carried on fighting for sort of 2 years after that, particularly in those southern provinces. I think the capitulation was total very, very, very soon.
Yeah, they did fold.
Just ask, sorry, do you have personal experience of Afghanistan?
Yeah, well,
the answer is yes.
Yes. I think they staggered on, didn't they? And even, the Taliban didn't take over straight away, did they? It was a gradual, rather sort of inevitable process. But they had their own resources to an extent. So if you look at it, they were there in Sangin and Lashkar and Garmsir, but these places just folded, I think, within a year or two of our pullout in 2014.
Okay, question online from Dick Bateman. What did the British soldiers think would have been an appropriate response to the 9/11 atrocity in Afghanistan?
British soldiers' response?
I guess the question is, was that on their minds when they were in Afghanistan? Did they feel they were responding to 9/11 in some way, or what?
Right. Now, that's interesting, because they'd all have different views on this, of course. I think that not only would they all have different views, but the views changed through this whole period, because they were only obeying they were only following the strategy that they were given by politicians and more definitely their command structure, and that strategy, as we know, changed many times over this period. And so a lot of the guys were genuinely, I think, confused about what they were doing. But what soldiers always do in these situations, of course, is they are there to fight for each other. Especially in 2009, they were taking such a pummeling from IEDs, and that it was very, very grim. They got through, I think, by telling each other that they were there for each other, sort of, they might have said to me that they were there to, for example, to give the Afghan people an alternative to the Taliban. For example, by getting them to supporting their livelihoods in the fields, by helping them to grow wheat rather than opium. They were there to rebuild schools, open schools after the Taliban had closed them the first time round. So they would try to persuade themselves, I think, that they were there to do good for the Afghan people as well. But I think they were genuinely left nonplussed a lot of the time because of these changing imperatives handed down to them by their commanders and above them, the politicians.
Thanks, Gareth. I'm currently writing a book about the Vietnam War as it happens, and that's a very similar response that the veterans of the Vietnam War have to, when they were fighting in it, that they, especially in the later years of that war, when they knew how unpopular it was back in America, that they weren't quite sure what they were fighting for, but inevitably they were fighting for the guys beside them. That's what the most common thing.
Yeah.
Have got any more questions? I think we've got time for one or two more. Well, very popular, right?
Thank you very much, Gareth. Really interesting. I'm just wondering, how do the lads react from being an armoured corps training at Bovington, etc., suddenly almost taking the role of infanteers in driving their mastiffs and that sort of thing? Was it a problem, or do they adapt quite easily?
I think they adapt very easily. They have to do whatever role is handed to them, don't they?
Yeah.
I think they just drove mastiffs because that gave them the protection to do all those sort of, as you say, almost logistical jobs, moving troops around, relief in places it's called. But they really like the jackals because that is a cavalry thing. The QDG is a reconnaissance regiment, so it's quite used to doing things fast, getting ahead of the main formation, and then just to spot the enemy ahead, and then get the hell out before the main battle starts. And that was always done, of course, in things like Saracens and Land Rovers and CVRTs, things like that. So the move to jackals, I think, was quite a welcome one for them, and they regarded it as a really good platform, still do. I mean, it's now come in big time, and everybody's doing it. But actually, you raise an interesting question, because I think, with army reorganization and the changing nature of warfare, roles are changing all of the time, and people have to be adaptable, don't they? The QDG have always been fighting reorganization. They're a tiny regiment, and they've survived it because they've managed to carve out for themselves this recce role. But what is the role of the reconnaissance soldier now? I mean, it's drones, isn't it? Look at Ukraine; it's all drones, and that's changing things massively. It's a great It's a great boon for the reconnaissance regiment. The drone, you just send them up ahead rather than personnel.
Thank you. Very interesting. Can I just ask one point? Did you have an interpreter with you as well?
They did, but not me. Because,
no, I see. I mean, your troop there.
Because of the embedded nature of my job, I was there with British soldiers all of the time. Very rarely had much contact with the Afghans, actually, which is another story, and it's a shame. But that's the nature of war journalism these days. You're not really allowed into these places unless you're embedded, which has got its pros and cons.
Yeah, very tough on the interpreters as well.
Yeah.
It's another nod to Vietnam. They stopped the freelance roving reporters after Vietnam because of all the publicity.
Yes.
I'll come to you next, Francis. We've got time for two more questions.
Thanks. Yeah, really interesting talk. Can you hazard a guess as to what the future of Afghanistan is going to be like? I know it's a bit of a difficult question, but having spent time there, what do you think the future holds?
It might come down to, the trouble is, it's not a democratic country, so you can't predict that there'll be a change of government, because there aren't elections and so forth. So you have the Taliban in there who they're not making a very good job of things, because the Taliban are not, although they've got some support, historically, because that southern arc of Pashtuns that we saw earlier, these are conservative, very religious people who are not anti-Taliban. In fact, they share some of those religious views, and they welcomed in the Taliban after that long, terrible period of warlordism, the Mujahideen fighting each other. There was no security and there was little development. And then there was the corruption of the Karzai government. So, you know, they're not going to be welcoming in or hankering after some sort of Western type government either. And so what they're going to end up with, who knows? If the Taliban have not demonstrated, even, well, the first time round, they did not demonstrate any particular competence at running the country. And then when they were allowed back in, or they took over, as we were pulling out, they were taking over, and they were making a real mess of things there as well. And so this is not going to be a popular government, but it, of course, has power. There is no way, clear way, because also, if you remember in the Mujahideen days with all those warlords, there were some powerful people back then who could overthrow governments. The Northern Alliance, for example, General Dostum, powerful people with big armies of their own, ex-Soviet, you know, equipment and so forth. They could do things. That's all gone now. So that looks to me like the Taliban are there for quite a while, unless there's some external force of some kind. I don't know what that could be, but I can't see it ending anytime soon.
Yep, last question, maybe appropriate. Most of the war correspondents I've met have been, both men and women, have been single, not married. And I just wonder how you negotiated with your family about doing these trips. Perhaps I should pass to you.
I think it was always a calculated risk. You know, I wouldn't just go off. Well, I might have done very early on in the early days, went off onto some almost wild assignments. But, you know, first thing actually is that most of my, or a lot of my war stuff was done with the BBC. And they are a brilliant organisation at protecting people as far as possible. You know, I can't remember the last time somebody was badly injured or died. Frank Gardner actually might have been the last one that I can think of. But you know, you get hostile environment courses updated every few years. The training is really good, and you know that when you're there as well, certain protection is in place. And the army themselves, of course, were very good. That I felt very protected by these guys. I was one of them in a way. So that's what I could pass on to my wife and tell her that I was going to be in safe hands as far as possible. You know, and also, well, there's a risk in everything we do. And even, you know, crossing the road in Bath, if you're not careful. In fact, that's what they tell you on the hostile environment course, you know, what are the most dangerous things? And everybody thinks, oh, yeah, you know, oh, getting shot by an RPG or getting bitten by a snake in the Australian outback. Well, it isn't, of course, it's the RTA, the road traffic accident. You know, 2,000 people die in this country from RTAs. So I think I was able to put this case to my wife and persuade her that way.
I'm not sure she's looking fully convinced, Gareth. Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to thank the audience for some terrific questions tonight and really engaged discussion. And now, would you all join me in saying thank you to Gareth Jones? Thank you.